What's up, metal and heavy music fans? These are the death metal albums that I would recommend to new listeners in the genre.
Fire of the chainsaw.
Alright, first up we have Cannibal Corpse with a Skeletal Domain. This may seem like an odd pick from the many albums most people would have gone with, but if we're going with the theme of death metal that will actually be palatable to somebody getting started, this is the album I would go with. It's a little bit more melodic and catchy than some of the other classics, but with no less of the brutality, and I defy you to find somebody who can resist screaming, "Fire up the chainsaws." And also, it's just very consistent and honestly one of my favorites of theirs overall, the perfect way to dive into Cannibal Corpse and brutal death metal as a whole, if you ask me. Next up, I'm going to go with a classic in death with Scream Bloody Gore. Of course we need to include death, and if we're looking for something that is both accessible and an enduring legacy album while also being the perfect representation of what old school death metal has to offer as a whole, this is the easy choice. Younger listeners may pick up on its dated sound and mentality, but I think even they will get over that in a matter of seconds given just how fun it is to bang your head to. As far as going back to the origins of the genre, it's hard to go wrong with Scream Bloody Gore. Flipping to something a little bit more modern though, we have the Black Dahlia murder with Unhallowed. I feel like this is the perfect gateway album for people who like metalcore, deathcore, and melodic death metal, as it perfectly fuses the best elements of those styles into a record that feels like an updated version of brutal death metal for the new era. It's packed with the same types of lyrics and overall atmosphere you could expect from the classics, but now with a seemingly endless array of melodic guitar hooks. They've made better albums since then, but this was definitely a transitional album for me, and the one that perhaps best fits on this list. It's Trevor's number one as well. On a similar note, we have Aborted with Retrogore. Another album for those just looking to dip their toes in using a more modern release. Much like Unhallowed, this album has a lot of retro influence from the performances to especially the lyrics and aesthetic, quite literally wearing the horror and gore on its sleeve. But once more, it's also incredibly catchy from the infectious title track to the deeper cuts. Furthermore, its meat-grinding pace scarcely gives you a second to take a breath, and by the time it's over, you'll just want to spin it all over again. But back to some more legacy acts, we've got Immolation with Close to a World Below. This album released to pretty broad critical acclaim after the band had been kind of dwindling in terms of quality over the years, and rightly so because it really just gets under your skin with that unmistakable searing sound of their guitars amplified by 1000 alongside apocalyptic sounding barrages of drumming. Listening to this just sounds like tumbling down into a chasm into the fires of hell, but in a strangely enjoyable way. Just ravaging from start to finish and something that I think even those new to the band will appreciate. So I was editing this video and I realized some of you may be asking why I'm not recommending more palatable melodic death metal albums from the Gothenburg movement like In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, etc. And those were the first bands that I really got into and still love to this day, but the reality is, they weren't really the best gateway to the more old school and brutal stuff I'm trying to open the door to in this video. They just got me into more melodic death metal. If I were to recommend something more in that style, it would probably be either Surgical Steel or Heartwork from Carcass, since they arguably do the best balancing act with their harsher death and grind roots. But I feel like everybody mentions those albums, and if you really want to hear more of my thoughts on albums like that, you can check out my dedicated Melodeath albums for beginners list. And by the way, if you're enjoying the video, be sure to hit the like button, and if you're new here and you want to see more, consider becoming a subscriber. Then we have Deicide with the Stench of Redemption. So once more in a similar vein, this was also called a return to form by critics and features one of the band's strongest lineups to deliver on some seriously memorable tunes. There's a little bit more emphasis here on melody right from the start with the wicked solos and songs sounding tighter, heavier, and more engaging than ever. Also, compositions like Desecration and The Lords of Sedition just feel on a much grander scale than anything that they had done previously. Punishing, but in a good way.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Then one of my personal favorites on here, Nile with Black Seeds of Vengeance. Not only do these guys sound great from the beginning with those battering blast beats and absolutely devastating vocals that you'd expect, but the extra layer of Egyptian imagery and atmosphere helps add that extra layer of intrigue. And basically this sophomore effort takes everything great about the debut and steps it up. The atmosphere is bigger, the songwriting more complex, and the performances absolutely jaw-dropping. You get to that chanting part on Defiling the Gates of Ishtar with the gong in the background, and you really do get transported to another place in time. Definitely something to recommend to someone who's struggling to recognize how much more death metal can be than just shock and gore. Next up is Entombed with Left Hand Path. Another classic that is easy to recommend to almost anyone. There's just something about that HM2 guitar sound that seems designed the same way as packing addictive food with salt and sugar.
Just hook it to my veins!
There's a reason why so many bands are still using it to this day across genres. But aside from the riffs, it also just has an incredible atmosphere, not only for the time, but one that still holds up today. It's number 82 on Rolling Stone's greatest metal albums of all time for a reason. Then another very personal pick here with Morbid Angel's Domination. I know a lot of people would go with Altars or Covenant, but if you ask me, those are a little bit more difficult listens. I had a harder time getting into those. This was the first Morbid Angel album I heard and among my first death metal albums. Where the Slime Live may be my favorite Morbid Angel song of all time. It's just so weird and unique. The vocal performance is so bizarre and memorable, and it breaks out of the usual death metal mold, which I really appreciated as somebody looking for something with substance. The atmosphere and focus on groove lead to a diverse array of compositions, with each song having its own personality. You've got Dominate, Eyes to See, Ears to Hear, which has another really infectious vocal part. Dawn of the Angry with that instantly recognizable tremolo line and all that crazy shift and pacing. Just another album I would describe as very fun to listen to. And then I felt like this list couldn't be complete without Dying Fetus, and I went with Wrong One to Fuck With. I almost went with Destroy the Opposition, which has its own obvious strengths and was also among the earlier classics that I took a liking to. But for the purposes of this list, I feel like this album might be an easier sell to a brand new listener given the updated production and matured songwriting. You still get all the usual tropes of this band and the genre, from the insanely technical riffage to the brutal guttural vocals, but packaged in a way that is just a bit more palatable for modern audiences to then work their way backwards from. But now it's your turn. Let me know down in the comments, what death metal albums would you recommend to a beginner in the genre? Check out this video for my rankings of my favorite death metal bands, and check out this playlist for some of my favorite death metal releases of the previous year. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.